Welcome back to another edition of Financial Therapy. It's not just about the money. And I want to talk about something today that I think is really important. It's going to set us up for some future discussions. But I think having this knowledge that we're going to talk about today will be very, very helpful. And we're going to basically talk about recovering from really deeply distressing or disturbing financial experiences. So let me ask you this. In in your life, have you ever just been in shock over something or really been upset, had some type of upheaval in your life or distress, chronic or ongoing stress that just didn't let up? Same with the pain, maybe emotional or physical pain, been anguished or just suffered, been in agony, misery, really had deep sorrow or grief, maybe heartache or heartbreak. Have you been disturbed or deeply worried or had a lot of anxiety? Maybe suffered damage or been hurt, been wounded, been really deeply confused. Have you have you ever experienced any of that? Well, if the answer was no, you can go ahead and go about your day and do something else right now. I think all of us can relate to something in our life that would fall into that category. Now, here's the interesting thing. Everything, all those words that I just used are synonyms of trauma. Now, what's a synonym? A synonym is a word or a phrase that means exactly or nearly the same as another word or phrase. Uh, for example, shut is a synonym of close. They really mean one and the things. So when I talked about shock and upheaval and sorrow and heartbreak and being disturbed, anxiety, wounded, all of these are synonyms of trauma. Now, I say that to say this. When I first started really taking a look at myself and going deeper into myself, a lot of self development, I started hearing the word trauma thrown around, and it's a very normal word in the mental health field. And I was always kind of struck by that word because to me, trauma was physical trauma. Okay, and physical trauma is some type of exposure to some type of physical violence or where you really feel your life is being threatened, or a serious physical injury, car accident, maybe a really serious illness, sexual violence, sexual abuse, or maybe like physical abuse, suffered in many ways, or actually witnessing somebody who had this happening to them while it was happening. That to me was trauma. I mean, and in some regards, trying to think about my life, I'm sure I've had some type of physical trauma, but I've, in many regards, I haven't had a lot of physical trauma in my life. I've had some, now that I think about it. but not a lot. But that was trauma. I mean, trauma was a really, really big deal, a big event, and an event probably that would be very hard to forget. So in mental health, and as I started doing my own therapy and being in 12-step groups and things like this, there's a term that was thrown around a lot, and it was called emotional trauma. Now, I didn't respond well to this idea of what? Emotional trauma? I mean, give me a break. What, again, trauma was physical. How can trauma be emotional? So I really thought in terms of kind of get a grip. Emotional trauma, come on. Now, obviously, I wasn't extremely aware back in those days. I was in a lot of, well, I just wasn't very aware. Because emotional trauma is probably more common than physical trauma. And emotional trauma is where a person experiences really upsetting or disturbing life events. It can be one big life event. I would almost say, for example, about most divorces are emotionally traumatic. So it can be a big event like that, or it can be a series of smaller, less intense events. So that's another a nuance of trauma. Is trauma does not have to be one big, huge, impactful event. It can be a series of smaller events when viewed as a one-off would not necessarily be traumatic, but when they happen over and over and over and over again can be very, very traumatic. This is called complex trauma. So the fact is that emotional trauma can be just as damaging as physical trauma. Even though physical trauma can be much more visible than emotional trauma, it can be just as damaging. And I've had many therapists and psychologists tell me in many cases that can be even more damaging. So, so I really want to normalize this idea of trauma. All of us have experienced it. All of us have had these episodes in our life. Nobody really escapes trauma, whether it's physical or emotional. So it's a word that I'm going to use as I talk about financial therapy. And I really want to lay the base of what it is. So we have financial trauma, and I heard someone say that financial trauma can really be boiled down to something just as simple as when expenses outweigh income for an extended period of time. Now, that's a definition of financial trauma. So, for example, let's use some of these synonyms that we've just gone through and apply that financially. So, have you ever had a sudden economic shock or financial upset? an upheaval or been in financial distress? Have you ever been fired from a job? How about chronic financial stress or strain, or you were raised in a family where expenses were always greater month after month after month than the income? Or any type of pain or anguish caused by money or economic suffering, agonizing over finances, being miserable around money or a financial state, having sorrow or grief or heartache involving a financial decision that you had to make or someone else made that affected you. If you're an employer, how about heartbreak over firing a worker? Or any type of ongoing financial disturbance? How about financial behaviors that were really disordered or dysfunctional? Or just chronic worry or anxiety around money? Feeling financially burdened, financial hardships, injury that came from financial issues or damage or hurt that came around money. Maybe financial wounding growing up, which can take all sorts of forms of things. Or just an ongoing financial fog and confusion. Okay? All of these are synonyms that describe trauma, and in this case, financial trauma. So, again, trauma is simply a deeply distressing or disturbing financial experience. Financial trauma is. So, hopefully, that really helps open up some of your understanding and maybe helps broaden your definition of trauma. And the opposite of trauma is healing. So when we talk about financial therapy, I think a very simple version of financial therapy is healing from financial traumas. So recovering from any type of trauma, and I found this interesting because when you think of it of trauma, there's probably 3 areas that could use healing from a trauma. Obviously, if it's a financial trauma, financial healing, right? Being made whole financially. If the trauma is physical or emotional, the body needs to heal from the trauma, and the psyche needs to heal emotionally. And physical trauma, quite frankly, could involve healing in all of those areas. Not only physically, but financially. Money touches everything that we do, right? And emotionally. Now, here's a real interesting thing. All of those are components of well-being. When we think of well-being, we think of what? Financial, emotional, and physical well-being. So, you know, the opposite of not being well or whole or having well-being is probably being in a state of trauma. So, hopefully that's really helpful to you. So what are some signs? And I think we'll deal with, say, signs of emotional trauma. And then I'll hit some signs of financial trauma. But signs of emotional trauma can be really intrusive thoughts. A lot of people who are traumatized find themselves thinking about the traumatic event that will come somewhere out of nowhere, and usually pretty regular. Now, this is true of financial trauma, whether it's a bankruptcy or losing a job. Um, Anything like this can pop up. And also, trauma, especially childhood financial trauma, just affects us. And oftentimes those memories are just below the surface that happen in childhood around money. Sometimes, obviously not. People who carry around a lot of emotional trauma also will have mood swings that can go from being really happy to just flying into a rage or becoming really depressed, and it often can happen on a dime. Emotional trauma and financial trauma can have changes in eating habits, definitely in spending habits for financial trauma, sleeping habits. Just anytime you tend to be eating more, spending more, or sleeping more than usual, that can be a sign of potential trauma. And so it's just not unusual to have a really hard time focusing, focusing in school, focusing at work, focusing in conversations, because the mind is always thinking about this traumatic event over and over. So some other signs are like insomnia, a lot of nervous energy, just hating where you are, hating your surroundings, lots of negative self-talk. Our inner critics are just always berating us and beating us up. Sometimes there's the sense of life is going to end soon. A sense that, bad things are just inevitable. Bad things just are going to happen to me. And there's a lack of joy from doing things that maybe once brought us a lot of joy. We begin to experience distance from people close to us. And in the case of financial trauma, you can just be afraid that every time the phone rings or you get an email or something, it's probably going to be from a creditor or somebody you owe money to, or announcing some dire financial event. Like in the case of a business, I went through a period of time, if I got an email or a phone call from a client, I just assumed that must mean they're going to fire me. So when we have suffered, other signs of suffering financial trauma specifically would be like being afraid that you're never going to make enough money, a lot of embarrassment about past business or personal investments, being really sad that you can't support your family in the way that you really want to, should, or feel you should. With money is talking about money is a huge taboo in our society. So there can be just a lot of anger that you have nobody to talk to around all of the financial struggles that you're having. Kind of a feeling of isolation, like you're the only person having this struggle. And in addition to that, you can't talk to anybody about it. Another one is a feeling that maybe you could accomplish more, you could do more. There's other people that are succeeding, but you don't know how to get there. You're afraid of wasting money, especially on yourself. You just maybe you don't. The problem isn't that you're not making enough money, but you just have a terrible relationship with money. So these are all struggles that we can have around money, and they're a sign of financial trauma. Okay? So what we want to do is to heal from these traumas. We want to be able to have a great relationship with money. We want to be in a place of having enough in our life, healing from past embarrassments, understanding that financial embarrassments are common and everybody suffers from them, that we're not terminally unique in that area. And here's the big one: dropping the shame that just surrounds money, the shame that surrounds financial trauma. It's huge. The shame is just so predominant. Like, when I say that money touches everything we do, I think shame touches everything that money touches. Money in itself is not shameful, but it is the shame that's projected onto money, and the shame that can be just so woven into our emotions, our psyche, our money scripts. So hopefully this was helpful, and I'm going to get into talking more about financial therapy and ways that we can heal from the trauma, from the financial trauma, because that is what it's all about. We want to become well. We want to become whole, right? And we want to live in a state of well-being, financially, emotionally, and physically. So that's why I often say that I think I'm more in the well-being business than any other business. So hopefully this has been helpful, and I look forward to bringing you more on healing from financial trauma in future episodes. So thanks and take care.